Good afternoon. I see that it's 3:30 and we're ready to begin. And I would like to welcome you to our OHM webinar this afternoon on interpersonal communication. My name is Louis Baskinger, and I am a team leader here at our BOCES. And I'm along with me this afternoon, Lucille Matt, another team leader in French, Lucille, team leader in Spanish, I am. And we have here Dana Gasca, and Dana is a world languages specialist here at BOCES. And also Dana is represents our Chinese contingency here. And then our director, Greg Smith. And Greg is in charge of our world language programs. And we, just to let you know, we are the people who are in charge of writing our examinations. And in addition to that, we run a local network for our world language teachers. So we're kind of used to presenting, and we think that this afternoon we have a pretty good program for you. Okay, here's our agenda, what we hope to accomplish. First, we're going to give you an overview of our OHM Checkpoint A exams. And it's exams because we're talking both about our modern languages and our ASL. We will then introduce part one, interpersonal communication. We will talk about the administration of it, the role of the teacher during the administration. Then we'll move to our rubric dimensions and scoring. And then we'll talk a little bit about some suggestions we have for preparing your students. And then we'll open it up to you to Q&A. So we've got a pretty good program plan. Okay, and I'm going to turn this over to Lucille.
Hi, everyone. I would like to tell you a little bit about OHM and some of the exams that we, excuse me, we write exams in American Sign Language, Chinese, French, Italian, and Spanish. We write them at the Checkpoint A level, and we write them at the Checkpoint B level. These exams are aligned with the New York State standards that were approved in 2021, and they most recently have been adhered to we adhered them to the principles and guidelines that have been issued by the state for the adopting and creation of benchmark assessments for Checkpoint A. That was adopted in 2024. We have a plethora of information about our OHM exams, which can be found on our website. So here's the link to our website. And when you get to it, you're going to be scrolling on the left-hand side, and you will find all kinds of documentation regarding the exams, albeit Checkpoint A or Checkpoint B. It's really worth a look. So to start off our program today, as Lou has already said, we're going to be working with interpersonal communication. We have a side-by-side chart here that is going to show you what is expected in all three modes of communication. But today we're just focusing on the interpersonal communication, which is the 30% mark for modern languages. That is different from the past. As you can see, it's gone up. Interpersonal speaking is 30%. If you go over to American Sign Language on the right-hand side, you're going to see interpersonal communication is at 20%. And for those of you who are unaware of or don't know too much about American Sign Language, you can see that there are different components to the exam that does not exist in the modern languages at this point in time. So as far as today is concerned, we are focusing only on interpersonal communication.
Okay, so I'm going to do a brief introduction to part one, interpersonal communication. So for modern languages, this is going to be the interpersonal speaking. And for American Sign Language, this is going to be the interpersonal signing portion of the exam. As you can see, there are two parts. We have part 1A interview and part 1B role play. Students must complete both of these parts on the exam. And you'll notice that they are very similar with a couple key differences. So in the interview, both the teachers and the students are going to have a natural conversation based on the prompt. And the students and teachers are going to be themselves. They're not going to role play a role. It's just like the conversations that you have in your classroom. You're each being yourselves. For the role play, the difference is that there is a scenario that is presented. We're going to tell you what role you will play, what role the teacher will play, and why you are having this conversation. So the students always participate as themselves, and the teacher is going to be the one that changes roles. So the teacher might be a host parent in another country. It might be your deaf friend, could be a store clerk, but they will get to play the different roles. So if we look at how many points for each one, as Lucille mentioned, for modern languages, interpersonal speaking is going to be 30 points total. So that would be 15 points for the interview and 15 possible points for the role play. For American Sign Language, because it is 20 points for the interpersonal communication, each task is going to be worth 10 possible points. And we do have a conversion chart for this that we will show later. So we'll go pretty much the same rubric, but use a conversion chart to get the points for ASL. So when can you administer the tasks for part 1? Administration can start anytime after April 1st, but it must be completed and scored at least 5 days prior to the administration of the other parts of the test. So this would be parts 2 to 4 for modern languages and parts 3 and 4 for ASL. And these scores would have to go to the building principal 5 days before. That being said, we don't want you to wait until the exam for the students to see this kind of activity. You should be incorporating this into your daily classroom practices. You cannot use the prompts that we have created for the exam for practice, but we do have sample prompts that are available on our website that you can use in your classroom to practice. You can use them, we would recommend even on assessments, you can practice this type of activity with your students. So don't wait until spring or right before the exam to introduce this activity to your class. Okay, looking at a prompt card, this is an example of what our prompt cards look like. You can see on the front of the card, it will tell you what kind of task you'll be completing. So is this an interview or a role play task? And then on the back side, there's a lot of information. So first of all, up in the corner, you're going to see the prompt number. And there are going to be 26 different interview prompts that are created for the exam. And there will be 16 role play prompts that are created. On the right-hand side, you'll see two different things. You have the topic and the language function. The topic is going to be one of the 13 topics that are taught at Checkpoint A, as found in the New York State Learning Standards for World Languages. And then the language functions, we have 4 different language functions that are targeted on our exam. The first would be exchange information. We have express feelings, express preferences, and express opinions. The main part of the card is going to be the prompt. So as you see, there is always going to be a setting. This will tell you why you are having the conversation, what is the scenario. And for ASL, these are going to be slightly different. Here you can see there is an exchange student. We're saying I'm an exchange student from a country. In the ASL cards, you will see things like I'm your deaf friend, or you're ASL teacher, these kind of things. One important thing to note is that each prompt has two requirements. So the first one is always going to be something where the student has to give some sort of information. And the second one, they're going to be asking information from the teacher. So there's always two, and students have to complete both of these requirements to earn full credit. Finally, on the bottom, we have a couple questions that the teacher should do before we start the conversation. So the first question is that they should ask students if they understand the prompt. Teachers are allowed to clarify if a student is confused about what the prompt means, but they are not allowed to give any suggestions or advice on how the student should accomplish the requirements. And then finally, who is going to start the conversation? So for all of our tasks, the student is able to choose who would like to start. So they can start or the teacher can start. Where can you find the prompts for part one? Prompts can be found in a couple locations. So first of all, you can order prompt cards from OHM BOCES and have these shipped to the school. Alternatively, digital versions of the prompts are available on our World Language Information course in BUZZ, which is our learning management system, where we have all sorts of resources. Once you order the exams, there will be lots of things available for the teachers to prepare, and this is where you can also get the digital versions of the prompt cards. And you can use these right from the computer, or you can print them out.
What is your role as the teacher? I want you to know that your role, you are always a conversation partner. During the conversation, okay, you can only use the target language exclusively. You must adhere to the prompt. You must follow what the two aspects of the prompt. You are going to allow the student the opportunity to advance the conversation and expand the conversation. And we're going to clarify those two terms for you. You must seek clarification if the student is not comprehensible. You want to allow the student an opportunity to rephrase, to say something that is more comprehensible so that the conversation continues. And you should provide some 2 to 3 minutes for each conversation. You should not rush the student through the conversation. Okay. So advancing the conversation, both the teacher and student are responsible for advancing. This isn't something that's just the teacher does, nor expect that just the student is going to do that. And when we define, and this information will also be found in our manual, by the way, okay, advancing the conversation means influencing its direction by making sure that you as the teacher are asking relevant questions. And we're going to talk about question asking. We're going to tell you that you need to be sharing opinions, and you should be giving description. You should be elaborating what you say and giving explanations. But you have to make sure that this advancement is always connected to the topic of the prompt. You do not want to lead the student astray by opening it up to an area where you are off topic. Clarification. You as the teacher should ask for clarification when a response is not comprehensible. You are to make the student aware that it was not comprehensible. In the target language, You could say, I don't know, I do not understand you. Can you please explain? I don't know what you're trying to say to me. Tell me it in another way, but it must be in the target language. And you should rephrase when the teacher realizes that the student didn't understand you. If you say something and you get no response from the student, don't say it again more slowly and a little louder. You rephrase. Okay. For example, okay, and this was taken from one of our student samples. If you want to look to the third, when the teacher is saying, do you have another favorite room? And the student responds, okay, by saying how many, and not a target language words, the word domino does that exist in Spanish. So the teacher says, domino, I don't understand. Explain it to me. So to allow the student to try to give a more comprehensible answer. Okay. Next, as teacher, your questions really are the basis for getting the student to participate fully and properly in the conversation. So there are some do's and don'ts. What should you avoid? You should avoid asking a question with a yes or no answer. In simple everyday conversation, that's fine. But here we want the student to produce language. Therefore, don't say, do you like school? Where the student will say no or yes. Tag questions where you as the teacher say something like, I like pizza. And you are the student, right? So what that does, it only makes the student say yes. Okay. So we want you to use open-ended questions. Why do you like school? Who is in your family? Or statements. Talk about your favorite foods. Tell me about yourself. Explain your favorite movie. So much of this, the way Dana said that we want the student to practice, we want you to practice throughout the year and use our rubric so that you have you know better how to examine your students when it's time for the test.
I just want to point out, there may be some of you here who have never seen ASL Gloss. And if you look at the third bullet in each one, that is ASL Gloss. ASL has its own set of grammar, and it is not English on the hand. So you become more familiar with it as you are exposed to it. But I'm going to show you what finger spelling looks like because I'm going to discuss this momentarily. But if you look under tag questions on the left-hand side, bottom, you're going to see best movies so far, S-H- etc. That is finger spelling. That indicates to the teacher that the student doesn't know the sign. So they're going to be using finger spelling in order to get across their idea. And I'm going to be addressing that momentarily. Next slide, please. So one of the questions that every year we ask ourselves is, what happens if a student uses English or any other non-target language word? English is pretty obvious, but what do I mean by a non-target language word? We could have heritage speakers, and they may use their native language instead of the target language. So I'm talking about both English and non-target language words, both of which are not allowed as being acceptable because they do interfere with the comprehensibility of what the student is saying. And what happens is the teacher is expected to ignore these isolated words or even phrases that are in English or in a non-target language. And they are expected to read the rest of it for meaning. If they can determine meaning, great. But if they can't, then they should seek clarification by asking the student, what I don't understand, what did you mean? And have the student explain further. So how can a student explain further? Circumlocution. It's very a good practice for students to use in the classroom all throughout the course of the year. If they got stuck on a word, how do they approach it? For example, they forgot the word for tree. They could say big bush. However, students are allowed to use proper nouns, titles, like movie titles, for example, brand names like Coca-Cola, Doritos, in the non-target language. So you have English words that are going to come in, the place where they're born, for example. Those are all acceptable. And then the rest has got to be in the target language. So if they use English or the non-target language and it causes confusion, comprehensibility is impaired in some way, then they need to seek clarification from the student. This slide has an example for us. This slide happens to be a French example where the teacher initiates on the left-hand side and the student is on the right-hand side. The English version of the translation is in parentheses underneath each utterance. So I'm going to ask you to just read the first 2 lines, please, of both the teacher and the student. I'll give you about 30 seconds. Okay, in the first one, to start off the conversation, the teacher says, "Tell me about your house." And the student responded, "Blue." And I think most of us sitting here tonight would say, okay, this is not going to start off very well. All right, we only have a 1-word answer here. So you want to draw a little bit more. Tell me more about your house. Perfectly legal for the teacher to say, looking for clarification, looking for expansion, and hopefully some advancement. And the student says, it watches, looks at, because in French the word regarde can mean watches or looks at. Pretty. Pretty is an English word. We strike it immediately. That's why there's a strike through the word pretty. We cannot count that word. So the teacher is expected to look at this and say, the student is telling me, it watches, looks at. I don't know what that means. All right. So therefore, I'm going to go back and I'm going to ask another question. Je ne comprends pas. Qu'est-ce que tu veux dire? I don't understand. What would you like to say? What do you want to say? And then the student goes on and digs a deeper hole for himself in this particular conversation. Je ne veux pas. I don't want. So that leads me again to believe the student is really not following me well. All right. So the student hesitated in the second utterance. Does that matter? Not at all. If the student hums and, says, stutters even, that does not count against him. You're using the language that they give you in the target language. In this case, he used English and he happened to, I say he, it could be a she, obviously, or they. This would clearly indicate that the student really does not comprehend the word pretty, all right, in this case. So I think for ASL, I want to make sure that you realize that any spoken word, whether it's in English or in a heritage language, a native language of the student, any spoken language at all is not a sign and it should be ignored. So the total amount here is that English words are ignored. The teacher needs to try to make sense of what is left and after the English word has been removed. And then any spoken word in ASL is ignored. And in each case, the teacher should look for some sort of clarification. We want to make sure that the teachers are giving optimum opportunity to the student to continue the conversation and showcase what they know. So you ask questions, follow-up questions. This slide is about finger spelling, and it deals only with ASL. The finger spelling, students are permitted to finger spell some things. Proper nouns, such as the name of something, the Stanley Theater, someone's name, Greg, titles, the movie title, what is the most current one? Wicked, okay. Brand names, like I described before, Coca-Cola. I'm trying to think of, and I think I use Doritos as my other one. Words that don't have an established sign. Students who fingerspell any word that is not within those categories, they are not permissible and they should be ignored. And this is no different than it is for modern languages. I'm going to turn this slide over next to Dana. This is the example, all right? Look at the first one. In the first one, it says, me, live, Utica, all fingerspelled. Remember, I went over that. The hyphens between the letters indicate fingerspelled. You live where? Question word. All right. This is ASL grammar. This is what we call gloss. In this case, the students are allowed to spell proper nouns. So Utica is the name of a city, and it's completely comprehensible, and nothing is taken off for that fingerspelling. But in the next one, bedroom, like, why, homework, have, brother, he, finger spells annoying, do, go bedroom, study, quiet, there. There are signs for everything there, and facial expressions, non-manual markers. When you have annoying, you must take out the word annoying. So now the teacher has said, okay, I'm not allowed to count annoying. I have to ignore it, and I have to try to make meaning based on the rest of the sentence. In this situation, the sentence is still mostly comprehensible. You're able to glean a good idea of what the student is saying.
So I'm going to talk about guiding the conversation to a natural conclusion. When the student has been given the opportunity to address both the requirements of the prompt, it is the teacher's responsibility to close out the conversation. This should not be done in an abrupt way, okay, bye. Instead, we want it to be more natural. So if you're doing the interview, for example, and you're talking about your families, you might end the conversation by saying, thank you for sharing information about your family, or thank you for telling me about your family. Have a nice day. The role play, it's going to be very dependent on what the two roles are, but you should try to make it as natural as you can. The other part that I mentioned, though, is once the student has been given opportunity to address both the requirements. So you really have a big responsibility here. You don't want to end the conversation prematurely if the student hasn't had time to say everything that they want to say. So one thing that you can do before you close out the conversation is you can ask a generic kind of question like, is there anything else you want to say? And if you practice this beforehand with your students, they will get the idea, oh, she's asking if I have anything else to say. Did I do everything I need to do? And so this is a good way kind of to remind them, oh, hey, you have something else to do, or you didn't say enough, without directly telling them. You cannot come out and directly say, do you have any questions for me? This would be leading the student to complete part of the requirements. That's their responsibility. So after that, after the student has said everything, or you're comfortable ending the conversation, that's when you want to bring it to a natural conclusion. And you can see here we have an example from our manuals. This is an Italian example. So they are going shopping and the teacher asks, do you have anything else to say? And in this case, the student says no. And so the teacher brings the conversation to a close. Okay, continuing on talking about after the conversation, we're going to talk about how part 1 is scored. So part 1 is scored holistically. We're no longer looking at evaluating line by line, giving points each time a student talks. Instead, we are evaluating the response as a whole, not by the individual parts. So in order to do that, you cannot score anything until the conversation is complete. So no score for any dimension is able to be assigned until you are done with the whole conversation. While you are having the conversation with your student, if you like, teachers are able to take notes. It's not required. And in fact, I would keep notes. Personally, I would keep them to a minimum because you want to be focused on the conversation. You really want to be paying attention to what the student's saying, what you need to say next. It's a lot to keep in your mind. But if you wanted to take some short notes, write down some really good vocabulary that the student said that impressed you, write down some questions that the student said, or if there was something that confused you, you're definitely able to take notes. Just don't score anything until the whole conversation is over. So next we're going to be taking a closer look at the rubrics themselves. We're going to explain each of the dimensions and talk about the completion of the task and how it is a gateway dimension. We're also going to look at the ASL conversion chart. So here you can see the modern languages rubric. We'll look at the ASL rubric in a moment, but you will notice that it is very, very similar. So if you're an ASL teacher, you want to make sure you pay attention to this one as well because they're very, very close. I'll point out the differences. At the top, you notice that there is some things to fill out. You got the student's name, is it an interview and a role play? And this is because the rubric is also used as your scoring page. So this is where you will mark down what your score is for each of the tasks. At the top, you have, going across the top, you have the proficiency levels. So there's novice high, novice mid, and novice low. Now, New York State has said that for Checkpoint A, there is a target of novice high, and novice mid is what they consider to be passing. And looking down the left-hand side, we have our dimensions. So we have completion of the task. This one's a little different, and we'll talk about it in a moment, but it can only be assigned 6, 4, 2, or 0. Underneath that, we have our other dimensions: expression and understanding, comprehensibility and control of language, discourse and vocabulary. And you might notice there's some, X'd out portions. So if a student scores at least a novice low for completion of the task, they're going to get novice low in the other 3 dimensions. And this is because if you think about it, if the student said enough in order to complete the task, at least partially, they must have said something that you could understand. So like, for example, for completion, comprehensibility and control of language, they are minimally able to be understood. So you cannot assign a 0 for those 3 dimensions.
When I look at this rubric and what Dana began to explain, there is our first dimension, completion of task, is what we're calling our gateway dimension. And our completion of task, we are going to score it with double points. In other words, you're going to get a 6, a 4, or a 2. You can't give a 5, you can't give a 3.
Mhm.
And what the reason, our rationale for this is, it is the most important job of the student to complete the task of the prompt card. So we felt that it would be, it's to the student's benefit to give double points for this. When you score the student, as Dana said, when the student is all done, then you look at this and you begin to circle or check which box the student was demonstrated, and then you add up the number of points, which will give you, if a student has had, the top score for novice high, for all of them, they will get a 15.
Sure. Let me go through real
Oh,
quick just about the
okay.
ASL. I just wanted to show that, and then I will.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have much to say, honestly. It's pretty much exactly the same. The only thing that you will notice is under comprehensibility and control of language, instead of talking about pronunciation errors, instead we mention errors including those that are related to depicting verbs, inflection, and non-manual signals. The other thing is we do also have a conversion chart for the ASL. So once you get those 15 points, you'll want to look to the conversion chart and find out how many points out of 10 the student would receive.
Dana already explained to you our prompt card, so I'm not going to go over all of the details. I just want to reiterate that there are actually 2 requirements that the student must accomplish to complete the task. Tell me how you feel about my situation. Ask me at least one question. We did this intentionally for the idea of helping the student by giving the student, by opening up with 2 directions, the student has more of a chance of elaborating and advancing and completing the task. Okay. So let's see what the rubric says here. When I look at the completion of task, okay, I'm going to read the description of the novice high. The student completes the task using the targeted language function to clearly maintain and advance a conversation while addressing both requirements of the prompt. Okay, clearly maintains. Maintain is, we define it as responding and reacting appropriately to the teacher. Advance is influencing its direction in the conversation. So when I go back and I look at completion of task, I look to see, has the student responded and reacted appropriately? Has the student helped to advance the conversation? If the student clearly maintains and advances, there's your 6. When I look down to the novice mid, it is going to say that the student, okay, somewhat maintains and advances the conversation. And then for novice low, the student minimally. And then for 0 credit, the student is then able to initiate or maintain a conversation. We hope nobody gets that. It's important that your students are able to reach either the novice low, mid, or high, because that is what we call our gateway dimension. If a student is unable to initiate or maintain the conversation, the student gets a 0 and scores nothing for the entire task. And what Dana pointed out was, if a student does minimally complete the task, then the student for all the rest of the dimensions must receive points. So let's look at the next dimension, please. So once we have reached, we know that the student has met the gateway. Then again, when the entire conversation is over, then we determine our first dimension, which is for 3 points, 2 points, or 1 point, is going to be expression and understanding. And we're going to note that there are some key words here again, that for novice high, we say the student predominantly responds and reacts appropriately. Because again, we're looking at how well does the student express himself? How well does the student understand what others communicate to him? So predominantly means that the evidence is that the student responds appropriately to the majority of this category. And then we say that the student perhaps expresses varied and original ideas that may not be obvious part of the prompt, but they certainly pertain to the prompt. As long as we are on topic, you can accept the student creating some original thought to it. And remember that this would be a novice high, there would be minimal repetition of the teacher having to repeat himself or herself. There are no absolutes. Novice high does not mean perfection. Anything you want to add, Dana, before you go to your dimensions?
No, I think you covered it well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to take a look at comprehensibility and control of language. So this has to do with how well can the student be understood. Now, one of the key things to remember when thinking about this dimension is that you want to look at it from the lens that the student can be understood by someone who is used to communicating with novice language learners. So we're not talking about, somebody that you just dropped the student in a location with a heritage speaker that isn't used to dealing with novice language learners. You want to, this is from the point of view that can they be understood by someone who is used to this type of learner? The other major thing is that the errors do not interfere with the comprehensibility. So students are expected to make mistakes. I'm not just going to say that they're allowed to make mistakes. They definitely are expected to make mistakes at the novice level. It's just that do these errors interfere with comprehensibility? Now, according to the state at checkpoint A, control of language is comprehensibility. That is the only thing that matters. So these include any kind of mistakes that you can think of, grammar, conjugation, those kind of things, but also for ASL, this includes things like depicting verbs, inflection, non-manual signals. And for modern languages, this includes pronunciation. So does that error interfere or not? Any type of self-corrections, pauses, where the student has to think about it, those are not considered errors, okay? So again, at the high level, you're saying that students can be understood. When we go down to mid, you'll see they can somewhat be understood by someone used to communicating with novice language learners. And then the low is that they can minimally be understood. And the key here is that their errors force interpretation. So the teacher really has to think about what the student was trying to communicate. Our final dimension is discourse and vocabulary. So discourse and vocabulary, we are looking at two different things. The first thing that we are looking at is, does the student use simple sentences? Okay, so at the novice high level, they are going to predominantly use simple sentences. Most of the things they say are simple sentences. Might they have one that is a one-word answer? Sure. But you want to look at the conversation as a whole. Remember, we're scoring holistically. So as the conversation unfolds, what are the majority of the sentences, the language the student is using? The other thing that we're looking at with discourse and vocabulary is the vocabulary. And there's a few things to remember when you are considering the vocabulary that a student uses. First of all, is it specific to the topic or to the conversation that you are having? The student cannot just say random things that they know in the target language and be awarded for that. It has to be related to the topic and to the situation. Also, students are expected to introduce vocabulary into the conversation that hasn't been used before. So when we think back to those yes/no answers, that makes it a little difficult for the student to add in the new vocabulary. Whereas if you ask an open-ended question, the student has lots of different choices. They can include their own new vocabulary to the conversation. Vocabulary that is recycled from the teacher is not going to factor into this. So if they are only repeating things that they've heard in the conversation, things from the teacher or things that they previously said, those are not going to be considered. Okay.
Okay. I'm going to be starting a new section here, and that is the marker conversations. First, I want to tell you that the marker conversations will appear in the manual alongside with other conversations that are not in this particular webinar. Some background information. Students actually, we requested throughout the state people to give us some material with which we could work, student samples. And then we sat down with a committee and we looked at them and scored them. So what you're going to see now is the marker paper and what the student actually has produced. And then from there, how the committee graded it, all right, at this point in time. So the first one up is an interview. Dana, next slide, please. And I want to review with you again the prompt. You can see that this is going to be a interview. This is not a role play. How do I know that? I'm looking in the bottom, at the very bottom in the circle, it will say interview. So the teacher and the student are playing themselves and they're just simply talking. They are conversation partners. This particular, the topic or the theme is house and home, and the language function is to describe. The prompt and the number 4 above it, that just happens to be the 4th of the in line of the marker papers that we have. We just happened to choose number 4 for this presentation. So the prompt is, we are going to talk about where we live. 2 parts. Both Dana, Lou, and I are trying to make an impression on you that there are definitely 2 parts when you look to score. The first part is, give me details about your home. So we're expecting the students to give you information about their personal living lodging. And the second part is to ask me, the teacher, questions or details about my own home. So put that into your mind as I go to the next slide. Also in the bottom again, whoops, I'm sorry, Dana. Can you go back? Okay. I'm going to ask the student, do you understand the prompt? They're going to say to you, yes, no. You're going to explain. Who's going to start the conversation? Next slide, Dana. In this conversation, the student has decided that the teacher is going to start the conversation. Personally, from my standpoint, I would always encourage the students to start the conversation, because I used to tell my students, I know a lot more words than you do, all right? Why don't you try to control the situation by being the one to ask me the questions so I have to respond to you? Some listen, some don't. Some are nervous, some even cry, all right? We just have to deal with what comes our way. So I'm going to give you a minute to read the entire conversation. This conversation is in French. You're going to see the first 2 lines are from the previous slide that I dealt with. But please read the entire conversation. Remember that the English is in the parentheses underneath each. And I'll give you a minute starting now. So as we look at this, I'd like to first draw your attention to the 3rd line on the teacher side. The teacher did not fully understand when the student said, it watches or looked at, because we cannot count the word pretty. So the teacher says, I don't understand. What did you want to say? And the student says, I don't want. Teacher then says, okay, I can see that he's not understanding. Let me dig a little bit more. So the teacher comes back out and says, how many rooms are there? Hoping that the student recognizes the word rooms and can give me an appropriate response. Bingo. That was a vocabulary word that the student understood, and the student gives him a full sentence. There are 3 rooms. And the student says, 3 rooms? That's not a big house. Do you mean to say 3 bedrooms? And the student says, yes, I have 3 bedrooms. Do you have a house? Teacher, yes, I have a very beautiful house. My house is white. I like white houses. So as you can see, we're building into the student who really is depending on the teacher to drive this conversation. There's no advancement here on the part of the student. Teacher then responds and said, what is your favorite part of the house? There's nothing we take off for the ums, okay? I like the house. It's comprehensible, but is it appropriate? I'm asking you about your house, what you like about it. I like the house. Maybe the student likes everything in the house. Oh, c'est bon. I'm sorry, that's the French. Oh, that's good. Do you want to say something more? Here's an attempt by the teacher. Please give me something more tangible that I can work with in giving you a higher score than what you might be earning right now. And the student responds, no, thank you. I'm done. Okay. This is the extent of what we're going to get. Okay. So that having been said, on the next slide, Dana, we are showing you now the dimensions, the completion of task, expression and understanding, comprehensibility, control of language, discourse, and vocabulary. Please keep in mind the completion of task, all right, is double. It goes 6, 4, 2, or 0. Remember also, if it's a 0, you can grade nothing else of that conversation. So when we looked at this, we felt that the student struggled to maintain the conversation. It was dependent on the teacher and really didn't advance the conversation. Minimally completes task by minimally addressing both requirements of the task. All right, the student asked, not give me details about your house, but do you have a house? There's a difference there. In total, we scored it a 2, even though the student did provide some details. They were minimal. Blue, big, and 3 rooms. So there are some details. We did not feel that this was a 0. This should be scored. Expression and understanding. The student sometimes responds and reacts appropriately in the conversation. frequent repetition or rephrasing on the part of the teacher are needed to continue the conversation. 2, comprehensibility and control of language. And I may say that 2 is in the middle. This section is scored by 3, 2, 1. Comprehensibility and control of language. The student can be understood by someone who is used to communicating with novice language learners. Errors in pronunciation, the use of English, they do not interfere with the overall comprehensibility. That's the key, overall. The state has indicated that we are no longer looking to utterances. Dana mentioned that earlier in our presentation. The state is looking for a holistic approach to grading. We felt this was a 3 for this category. Discourse and vocabulary. The student sometimes uses simple sentences and sometimes uses one-word responses and sometimes phrases. So the student had a mixture of all 3 types. The student introduces little variety of vocabulary. Blue and big were what they brought to the table. All right. At various points in the conversation, despite introducing little variety, the discourse was strong enough to carry the score into the novice mid-range. So this student was scored overall as a 9 out of 10 points. So the key here is to always remember the comprehensibility of the overall conversation. All right,
Just a
Dana's going to.
quick correction there, and it's 9 out of 15 points.
I'm sorry, 9 out of 15. I'm thinking of ASL. All right, thank you.
Yep.
So we're going to, Dana's going to continue now with another example for us.
Yeah, we're going to look at a role play example. And this time it's going to be an ASL example. So the prompt here is that I am a deaf student in your class. I video call you before school to tell you that I am sick. So in the conversation, you will tell me how you feel about my situation and you will ask me about my illness. So again, we're going to take a look at the conversation. So I'm going to give you a moment to go through and read it. So the ASL gloss is on the top and then the English is in the parentheses. So I'll give just a minute. Okay, a couple things that I'd like to call attention to that might not be obvious when you're looking is there are a few times when the student uses an incorrect sign. So when they say, I'll get it, here they are using the sign that would mean I'm going to receive something, as in I'm going to get a gift, and not the sign for I'm going to go get something, I'm going to go retrieve it from somewhere else. And then they do also use the incorrect sign for pretty good. So in ASL, you wouldn't use the sign for pretty as in beautiful. You would modify the sign good. So just a couple small minor things to keep in mind. And so we'll go ahead and we'll take a look and see how we decided to score it. So for this one, for the completion of task, we did give this one a novice mid. The student can definitely maintain the conversation and even advance it in some spots. However, they're missing the second requirement, which is to ask the questions. Now you might look at it and say, well, wait a minute, there are 2 questions there. But if you look, the first question, what are you doing? It doesn't really have anything to do with the topic. The student is not asking, how are you feeling? What's wrong? Anything like that. The second question is the doctor. It is a question, doctor, but it's impossible to know what the question is. We don't know if they're asking, did you call the doctor? Did you see a doctor? What did the doctor say? So we felt that it wasn't strong enough to say that the student had covered that part. And so that's why we did give this one a novice mid. Under expression and understanding, for the most part, the student responds appropriately. There are some things that maybe are a little questionable, but the student is able to answer any questions and move the conversation forward. So the teacher doesn't need to repeat anything. They don't need to rephrase things. And occasionally the student has an original idea. For example, you need to rest. So we did give this one a novice high, which is 3 points. Under comprehensibility and control of language, we thought the student could be somewhat understood. So there are some incorrect signs that cause confusion. There's also some things at the beginning of the conversation that you're not really sure what the student is trying to say. And so we thought that mistakes did interfere, not as much as, that the teacher had to interpret a ton of things. So we didn't want to give it a low. So we did give it a novice mid. And then finally, for discourse and vocabulary, we do have kind of a mix, simple sentences and one-word responses. There is some vocabulary in the conversation, doctor, rest, but we didn't feel that the vocabulary was strong enough to bring it up to a novice high. So novice mid. And so this would be 11 points. And if you remember, for ASL, there is a conversion chart. And so this student would get the 7 out of 10 points for the task.
Well done, ladies. If I could just take a minute and just review a couple things. Remember, the most important aspect is this is holistic scoring. You need to practice. Again, we've mentioned practice throughout the year so that you are so familiar with this rubric that this becomes, like a gut feeling as you listen to the student that you are able to determine. And there are other, as Dana or Lucille said, we have other samples. We don't have time to show them, but they're in our manuals, so you should look. Also, we didn't have any, I don't believe, for being on task. I don't think we had an example of 6, but I want teachers to understand that students do get those and and when we polled teachers, we did get them, but we felt it's better to train you, to show you not the top necessarily, but a little bit of where things are all over the place. So I'd like to just talk a little bit about preparing your students for part 1. They're, other than just doing this, just like the exam, okay, and doing it often. Number 1, the interview is an everyday classroom activity because the teacher, your role as a language teacher should always be that you bring conversation into class. So that task for our kids should be something that they're used to, because every day in my French class, says Lucille Matt, she talks with their students. Every day, Dana greets her students and asks them something about what's going on in school, or what's their family like. We know that as language teachers, we know more about our kids than any other teacher in the building because we constantly generate conversation. So I'm going to tell you that, first of all, I think you should have group conversations often. Now, although this is conversation, there's nothing to say that we can't do this in a written form and then have a conversation. Sometimes with my students, I would do this as a choral group that everybody would write. I would say to them, Tell me about where you live. And give all the kids in the classroom a minute to write something about that. And then I would go back and I would ask. And to make it spontaneous conversation, if they said, I live in a big house, then I would, the same student, without the opportunity to write, I would say, well, just how big is the house? How many rooms are there? What are the rooms in your house? Do paired conversation practice, then bring it to a group conversation for the whole class to participate in. A technique that's very, very popular nowadays, you're probably using it, conversation mats. If you don't know what a conversation mat is, then go online and find out. Do speed interviews. Make it a game. Make it move fast. I ask Greg a question, he doesn't respond fast enough, he gets no point. I move on to Lucille, etc., so that it becomes something fun. Great technique is Jeopardy in class. Always to get them to learn how to form questions, so questions become second nature to them. As soon as I say, my house is red, oh, that's ugly, my house is white, then I'm going to turn around and I'm going to say, and what color is your house? And why is your house blue? Okay. And then do sentence expansions. Sentence expansions are simply, you can sit with your students, and when a student makes a comment, you can hold up a little card to say why or where or when, etc., to move this on. And I'm sure you all have your own ideas about how to prepare your students. And something I'm going to tell you that always works, and it builds confidence in a kid. You are not testing them every day. You are practicing. So after you do a conversation about, tell me about where you live, after you've discussed it with 3 or 4 students, practice, do the same conversation again. So kids have practiced it once, they've heard what's going on, they've heard what their classmates have done, and now they can have a chance to improve. Okay? Let's see how we're doing. Okay, we're at questions and answers. And Greg, you said that you had some common questions. Do you want to bring those up, or how do we want to do this?
There are some questions that got repeated, and I did answer them in the Q&A in written form already, but I'll bring up some of the ones that stand out to me for you guys to address as well. I'll also encourage people to add more questions to the Q&A as we are in this remaining 14 minutes. We have the opportunity to address even more than has already been addressed. So in terms of ones that are good questions that were asked multiple times or really stood out to me. The first one would be the question, is there a requirement for the number of sentences or utterances that the student needs to have in the conversation?
I'll do that one because it's an easy one. No, we no longer are doing utterances. We're doing a holistic conversation. And there are two goals in each conversation. If the student is able to accomplish those within 4 or 5 exchanges, fine. If it needs more because the teacher has said, is there something more that you need to add to this? Then you let the kid realize, as Dana said before, that they haven't accomplished the 2 purposes of the prompt. So no, there is no expected number of exchanges.
Very
But
good.
it is valuable when you're training your students to say, give me more. I'm not happy with that. All right. If you want to get it, all of you who are planning on advancing your education beyond high school, you need to realize that you want to get a very good score on this, and it's totally possible. especially with a holistic approach. So you would say to your students all year long, no, 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 come on, give me more. You can give me more. I know you can. All right. And they will, if you train them that way, they'll rise to the occasion. But it's not something that can be begun in April or even in May. It has to be continuous throughout the year so that they're used to it. As Dana had said earlier, they're used to it and it's going to roll off their tongue.
New question?
Yeah, Dana, I'm going to target this one to either Dana or Lucia because I know you've answered questions via like email and phone calls on this topic before. I'm not sure Lou has. So I'll let Lou dodge the bullet here. If there's some type of IEP or 504 plan accommodation that a student has, how is that addressed in relation to some of the requirements that OHM BOCES has in place for our exam?
And any IEP or 5014 plan must be adhered to by the state. Okay, you have got to do whatever that plan says, whatever accommodations it is. If it's 2.5 times the time to do the test, then it's 2.5 times to do the test. That is a state rule and regulation that the IEP is set into by the special ed department. That IEP is set specifically for the individualized education of that individual child. And even though we may have 6, 7, even 8 or 10 IEPs or 504 plans in our class, each one has to be addressed individually and accommodations must be made.
All right, and I'm going to just extend, even though this wasn't included in a comment, I'm going to extend it further and let everyone know as well that even if the IEP or 504 plan accommodation stipulates something that is completely illogical to the exam, such as test read with a reading section that still needs to be read out loud to them. And I know that turns it into a listening section, but that's what it says, the 504 plan or the IEP plan. So so do follow that. That is law, and no exam provider, including the state as the Regents exam creator, can supersede that. Yeah.
And accommodations for special ed students where there is a case where it needs to be read, that has to take place in a separate venue, a separate room from where the majority of your students are taking the test, which I assume most of you know.
Very good. Hey, Dana, I'll tab you for this one since we haven't heard a question for you yet. Can we give copies of the rubrics to students in advance of the exam?
Yes, they can. In fact, they should have them before the exam. You should let your students be familiar with them so that they know how they are going to be evaluated, for sure.
Very good. Are there practice prompts available for teachers that they can look at now and use as practice with their students ahead of the test?
We do have some sample prompts available on our website. I think Greg put the link in the chat at some point, but they are in the released exams section. You'll find the sample prompts.
And we also are in the process, we hope to create more samples. We've been doing that with our local network.
Very good. A new question came in. Will you be having a webinar for the Checkpoint B exam?
Right now, we don't have the guidelines for the Checkpoint B exam. It is anticipated that we will be receiving them, according to Candace Black, at the end of this year, end of the school year. At which point we would then be doing the same process that we have for the Checkpoint A, establishing our format, and then I'm assuming that Greg would also approve having webinars at the state level for everyone who would like information about our exams. Yes.
Yes, and it sounds like provided the timeline from SED is adhered to and we get that guidance this May or June, I believe they said,
Right.
then we'll have much more time to develop our exam and create manuals and rubrics and things like that. Much more advanced than we are here now with the Checkpoint A. But the reality is we got the guidance, was it mid last school year, I believe? And we've been full systems go ever since then, trying to get to the point we're at now, which has been pretty astounding, and we hope everyone's happy with the work that's being done. We've done it in large part in conjunction with the input and feedback of you all. So thank you for your part in helping this process be what it is now. How about, oh, this one came through probably 3 or 4 times. When is the Checkpoint A exam administered, and specifically referring to parts 2 through 4 for modern languages and parts 3 and 4 for ASL? When do we give that?
Okay, OHM has a flexible administration date for those parts. And it is established annually once we receive the information from the state as to when the normal time is for Regents exams. You may give it on any day of those Regents exams. However, each language that you give in your school district must be given on the same day. You cannot say, today I'm giving the Spanish exam, tomorrow I'm giving the French exam, and then I'll give the Italian and the ASL exam on different days. That way it's spread out. You must give all the exams on the same day, but you get to choose the date.
As long as it's a Regents exam day, and all of the schools in your district that give a Checkpoint A exam do it on the same day. All right, it's a district by district decision, not a school building by school building decision. So you'll need to work in conjunction with your district administration to set that date, presumably. Can we record our conversations so that we can listen and review them more than one time?
So,
Dana, I know you know that one.
yeah, so the conversations can be recorded. However, they should not be reviewed more than once. You can record them, and then as soon as you score them, you should destroy the recordings. And this is just to keep it fair between, students who haven't had the opportunity to have theirs looked at more than one time. So.
And that decision comes, I guess that is our decision when it comes to Checkpoint A specifically, but its origin actually comes from Checkpoint B. When OHM BOCES was approved as a 4+1 pathways exam provider back in 2018, I believe was the year, the state required us to put that stipulation in place, or they enforced it upon us. And so with our Checkpoint B exams doing that, because SED told us to, then we made the decision universal, so they applied to our Checkpoint A as well. We must have opened up a firestorm because I just got 6 questions. We have 4 minutes, so we'll try to do this as quickly as possible. Hold true if it comes from a different BOCES. I'm going to assume that's referring to the recording piece, and the answer to that, and pretty much any question when it comes to Checkpoint exam administration, is whoever makes the test makes the rules. All right. Now, that said, the state does have guidelines that are in place that must be followed and how the exams are developed. But in terms of what rules guide the administration of the exam creator makes them, and they should be done in line with what the state says. Do Checkpoint A exams and Checkpoint B exams have to be given on the same day, Lucille?
No, they do not need to be given on the same day. They can be given on different days, so long as the Checkpoint B exam, all schools in your district that are giving the Checkpoint B exam gives it on the same day.
Okay. One of our participants alluded to the Regents exam calendar and said that the state has set aside June 23rd this year for the administration of Checkpoint exams. There's no question that's being asked, but I would like to clarify that even though the state suggests that the exam be given that day, it is not required. And as the exam provider, or as an exam provider, if your school uses our exams, you may choose your own exam date. It does not have to be June 23rd, but it does have to be on a Regents Day, and it does need to be done with all Checkpoint A exams being done on the same day.
Can I add to that, Greg? In 2011, when the New York State took away the Regents title from World Languages exams, it allowed us to be able to give our exam when we chose to give it. So the state does not have cannot impose upon any vendor to give the exam on a certain day. They can suggest a date so that it's easier for districts to put them into their calendars, but it is not a mandatory date that you must give the exam.
I got clarification on the earlier question that I was unsure on what it applied to, and that was if you use a different BOCES or a different exam provider, do you have to follow those rules? Or do you have to give them on the same day as if you're using perhaps a BOCES, OHM BOCES ASL exam and a Jefferson Lewis Spanish exam? So you're mixing the exam providers. And in that case, you would not have to give them on the same day because the Spanish exam coming from the other BOCES can be given when the other BOCES says it can be given. All right, so that's a complicated and layered question, but hopefully it came through clearly.
My friends, we are almost out of time. So at this point, I'd like to thank everybody for attending our webinar today. I think it was good webinar, and we certainly hope that we've been informative and helpful. Let's put our last slide up here again for our contact information.
I did also put into the chat, there's a feedback survey, but we'll probably also send it out afterwards because I know some people have already left. But if you could take a few moments to fill it out at some point, we would appreciate it.
Yeah, we'll send it out via email as well.
Yep.
If you don't click on the link or if you've already left, when can task cards be ordered by administration? Dana?
So the cards can be ordered at any time when you place your order for the exam. They're just not going to get shipped out until closer to the time that you would administer them. So, beginning of April, they will be available. But if, before you get them, if you order later, for example, you can always find them on the Buzz course as well.
Very good. Lou, final remarks?
Please be in touch with us. Please fill out the survey. Your comments truly are appreciated by us, and they help us and guide us. So again, thank you for your attention. Hey, panelists, thank you for being here this afternoon, and we'll be in touch soon.